Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're just letting everybody in from the waiting room, and we're going to get started in just a second. Thank you for joining us. You can feel free to drop in the chat where you're joining us from. If you have kids or children in your life, how old they are.
If you're a teacher, where you're calling in from.
All right, well, I think we've got everybody from the waiting room in here. Lynn, just keep an eye out for the waiting room in case anybody else pops in. So welcome everyone. My name is Kirsten, and together with my sister Lynn, we are the founders of the Anti-Racist Table, which is a multidimensional platform aimed at helping people bring anti-racism into their life as a daily practice. We do that primarily with our flagship free 30-day challenge, which helps educate people about anti-Blackness and helps them wrestle with the emotionality that goes along with this work, and helps them really learn how to be an ally and an advocate and to be part of the change that's going to dismantle systemic racism in America. And so that is why this event in particular is really important. Teaching, every day you're teaching kids, the children in your life, about race, whether you know it or not. And so we're very excited to be able to bring Dr. Erin Winkler here today to help give us a framework and tools about how we can do that in a more knowledgeable and skillful way. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Lynn. She's going to do a short land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. We would like to begin our time together, just honoring those who have come before us, the land that we are living on. We will be doing a land acknowledgement that has been inspired by Ruth King, who is a Black mindfulness practitioner that inspires us every day. So to start, I'd like to call on my ancestors to stand with me as I acknowledge the Native custodians of this land, Washington, D.C., the Piscataway land and the Anacostan land, the Piscataway people, those people who are named, unnamed, known, unknown, past and present. We honor all traditions and traditional custodians of this region, and we recognize their continued connection with this land, with this water, and with this community. We pay respect to the earth, whose generous resources sustain us on a daily basis, and we pay respect to the enslaved African people of this land who were brought here, held here, sold, and all of their descendants. And all of the people throughout the world that are in captivity. We pay respect to their spiritual labor, and we pay respect to those ancestors of ours whose unwise relationship to race and racism we have inherited. We pay respect to our teachers and our elders, past and present and emerging, and all of the young people today that are teaching us now. We honor this gathering, all of the people that are here, and our guest, Dr. Winkler, for taking time and energy to be with us today. May we all recognize that we all share an aspiration to be free in heart, mind, and body. Ashe, here ends the land acknowledgement.
Thank you. And I also dropped in the chat the website that we use. You can look up the land where you live. And I'm also going to give Dr. Winkler a chance to do her land acknowledgement after I was going to introduce you first. So let me go ahead and do that. So Dr. Erin Winkler is Associate Professor of African Diaspora Studies and Urban Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she also serves on the advisory boards of Childhood and Adolescent Studies, Ethnic Studies, in Latin America, Caribbean, and US Latino, Latina Studies. She earned her Ph.D. in African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and was a postdoctoral fellow in African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is the author of the book she's the author of the book Learning Race, Learning Place, Shaping Racial Identities and Ideas in African American Childhoods. She is pleased to have worked on projects about race, racial identity, and anti-racism with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, as well as with many parents, schools, religious and community organizations, businesses, and nonprofit groups. And we are very excited to have Dr. Winkler here. And so right now, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Winkler, for your land acknowledgement, and then we'll get started with some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here today. As you all heard, I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is a land of Menominee, Potawatomi, Peoria, Kickapoo, Miami, and Sioux nations. Thank you. Did you want? I didn't know if I was supposed to. No, sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. So, we thought right off the bat, we would kind of just talk about the elephant in the room, which is that you are white, and this subject, we're talking about African Americans, racial identity. Can you just tell us a little bit about how it is you came into this work?
Sure. Yes, I know. Usually after introduction, they're like, that sounds like a lot of African American studies for a mighty white looking person. So it's true, I am white. I ended up in the field. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I see we have people from all over here today. Some of you from the Midwest might have heard of Ann Arbor. It's where the University of Michigan is. And like many college towns, it is maybe a little too comfortable in thinking of itself as liberal. So when I was growing up, there was sort of an acknowledgement of racism, but the notion that it wasn't really a problem here, meaning, there. And I don't mean to pick on Ann Arbor, it's great in many ways, but I don't think that this is unique to Ann Arbor. And so it was very confusing for me as a child because I saw the world around me and I saw racialized patterns from a very young age, just from Black kids just proportionally getting put in this reading group or getting disciplined differently at school, all the way up to, through one thing from middle school. I remember, we wanted to sing a spiritual for our end of the year concert because the choir director let us have some, leeway. And he said, "Oh, Mary, don't you weep" was too religious, but then he chose an Ave Maria. And we said, "Why isn't that religious?" He said, "Well, it's classic," So all these kinds of things that we were seeing in the curriculum, in the world around me was very frustrating because adults were telling us, it used to be an issue, but it's not anymore. And yet we could see in the world around us that it was an issue. And so I was frustrated by high school that I knew these kinds of colorblind narratives around everyone can get as far as they want as long as they try hard enough and that kind of thing. I knew that was false, but I didn't feel like I had the information and the tools to really engage in those arguments because we weren't learning in school, some of the real history around these things. And so I wanted to study racial inequity in college, and I was told that sociology was the place you did that. But what I found once I got to campus that was really that African American Studies was the department that was really engaging in these issues in the way, in the really deep, critical, interdisciplinary way that was helpful to me. So that is how I ended up in the discipline. And from there, I just got very interested in how ideas about race develop and how we negotiate them in our everyday lives. And I started being interested in adults, but I kept sort of being interested in younger and younger. How do these ideas come to be in the first place?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's wonderful. The more allies and co-conspirators we have, people doing this work across the spectrum is what we need. So today we'd like to just dive right in and ask you, why do we need to teach children about race and racism? Aren't children colorblind?
Well, adults tend to think that children are colorblind for several reasons. One is that they often think that young children are just too young to understand ideas about race, and they're a little bit worried about maybe destroying children's innocence, putting ideas in their head that aren't there. And so they hesitate or aren't sure when and how to begin talking and teaching children about race. And then our culture overall tends to, I don't mean our US culture overall, especially, white dominant US culture tends to associate noticing race with being biased or being racist. And adults don't want to think of children as being biased or harboring racial bias. And so adults will often avoid talking about race with young children, again, because they don't want to create bias, they don't want to look biased, and so they just avoid it. Of course, the opposite is actually true. Research shows that children are already categorizing people by race, by infancy. You're like, how do you know what infants are doing? But these are sort of nonverbal tests that involve how long infants gaze at new faces. And then research shows that by age 2, children will use racial categories as one characteristic from which to reason about people's behaviors. And by ages 3 to 5, we see racial bias expressed in children very broadly. And so before anyone gets too upset here, I'm not saying your preschoolers or your children are little bigots or little hateful people, but what I'm saying is they are great observers of the world. And you know this if you're around kids. They're noticing everything in the world around them, and they're noticing patterns. And we're teaching them patterns. We're teaching them, to match their colors and their shapes and their animals. And yet somehow we're shocked that they notice, racialized patterns in the world around them. And they see patterns in neighborhoods, in their own neighborhood or other neighborhoods they pass through. They see patterns in, children's cartoons and Disney movies. Even if you don't let your kids watch those, they see who everyone wants to dress up as for Halloween, or they see, which princess is on the backpacks or those kinds of things. They see racialized patterns in their storybooks. In who's doing what or who's the hero or those kinds of things. They see racialized patterns in who has what kinds of jobs at their school or at their grocery store or at their doctor's office. So they are seeing racialized patterns in the world around them. The deeply, deeply racialized nature of our society guarantees as much. But while they're observing all of this, they want to know the rules. Right? The world is what developmental psychologists call their cognitive puzzle. They want to know how it works. And for a lot of the patterns they see, adults are helping them understand them. But for these racialized patterns, adults tend to be silent. And if adults don't help them understand why those patterns exist, children tend to internalize them as norms or rules, and they often infer that they're deserved or earned. So why would they think that they're deserved or earned? Well, when we do teach children about racism, we tend to teach them, especially younger children, but even elementary and middle school, we tend to focus on the civil rights movement. And research shows that the takeaway message for young children is that things used to be really, really bad and unfair. Then, thank goodness, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King came along and fought against this unfairness, and now everyone is equal. And therefore, the takeaway message for kids that adults don't realize is often that now we're equal. So when they observe patterns or inequities in the world around them, those must be earned or deserved. Now, I want to go on the record here and be very, very clear that I am not discouraging anyone from teaching civil rights history. It's very important to teach to kids. But there are age-appropriate ways that hopefully we'll talk about a little later to connect past unfairness with the present, to help kids see like how work has been done, but there's still work to do. So the last thing I'll say about children and color blindness is adults will often cite the fact that their child, avoided using racial terms when identifying, the only white child in the room or the only Black child in the room or so on. And they'll take this as sort of a badge of pride, like my child doesn't notice race or, that kind of thing. But honestly, what this really is showing us is usually that kids have learned that they're not supposed to mention race. So that maybe at some point they did, or, another child around them did, or someone else did, and the adults in the room got tense and shushed them and maybe told them that's not nice. And so really what they've learned more is not that race doesn't matter, because they see patterns in the world around them and race seems to matter, but that they're not supposed to talk about it, that there's a social norm, that this isn't something we mention. And so what adults often take as evidence of colorblindness is not that.
Thank you, Dr. Winkler. That makes perfect sense. And I think, that really just makes me think about how we are really planting these seeds in young children, just either to say, yes to diversity and inclusion and, or no and division and separation, that really those seeds, germinate and grow into adult ideas. So if we're not teaching children about, how to be inclusive, how to, be joyful for and celebrate differences, then that's going to affect what happens as an adult. So can you talk a little bit about how parents can teach their children about race, and also what does it look like also in the classroom, because we have both parents and teachers that are with us today?
Sure, absolutely. That's a really big question though. So I just want to temper expectations a little bit here, because so much will depend on the specific context of your child's life or of your classroom, the developmental stage of the child. When we say child, we might be talking from birth through, high school. And also I see people are here from all over the country, and I'm guessing from all different kinds of racialized and demographic contexts. So what I like to do is I have 7 tips that I like to give, and they're broad tips, but they're tips that can be, tailored to your specific situation. And so I'll give some examples of, from different contexts, kids with different racial identities and different ages, and hopefully that will be helpful in thinking through some of these things. I'm hoping to share some slides. So I do have 7 tips, but I want to say to our organizers that if I'm getting a little bit too professory with these slides, you let me know. So please jump in at any time, and we'll just see how far we can get. I also want to say too that that adults, parents, and teachers, they do these things with the best of intentions. And so this is not, at all to be judgmental about adults that are trying to protect the innocence of their children. And also for parents of color or teachers of children of color, trying to, make sure that they don't have to bear the weight of the world on their shoulders so young. So these are it's very understandable why adults often avoid these conversations. It's just that what we know now is it backfires. It does the opposite of what we're hoping or what we intend. So I'm hoping that these tips can be helpful for us to think about, okay, well, what might I be able to do instead of silence or instead of waiting? Okay, I'm going to work to share my screen. And then, can you all see the slides? Okay, good, great. Okay, so like I said, I have 7 tips I like to give. And the very first one is, before we think about how to talk to kids in age-appropriate ways about race and racism, racial identity, racial inequity, we have to get comfortable talking about these things ourselves. And the best way to do this is to do so with other adults first, just because it's very difficult to talk about things in age-appropriate ways with young children if we don't have a full grasp on the information ourselves. So I'll give you an example of once a white mother of a white son, I can't remember his exact age, but I think it was sort of early elementary, had asked me, what should she say to him when he asked, why are Black people poor? And the first thing I asked her is, well, what if an adult asked you that question, how would you answer them? And so she started by saying a little bit about, disrupting the idea that all Black people are poor, of course. But then in terms of trying to talk about why, if what the child is noticing is the disproportionate impact of poverty on Black and brown people in the United States, or the wealth gap, or any of those things that he wouldn't be able to articulate in that way as a 7-year-old, she wasn't really sure. She didn't really feel like she had the information really to explain why this disproportionate impact existed. And so that's just one example. We're not going to be able to explain it in age-appropriate ways to a 7-year-old if we're not really sure of the answer ourselves. Of course, it's a lot of work, and it can feel overwhelming. I wasn't taught this history. I wasn't taught this information. This lady has been in African American studies for 25 years, easy for her to say. But I do think that it's not something about shaming or guilting ourselves about what we do or don't know, but about making a commitment to, the responsibility to doing our best to learn in order to make a change. So don't feel so overwhelmed by what you may not know. Some of you are likely already experts through experience or necessity or choice, but it's about not getting overwhelmed, but really making, a concerted ongoing effort. What will this look like in my life to be educating myself, and also to, practice engaging, talking, all these kinds of things. So we start with ourselves. I promise that the other 6 points are actually about engaging with children. So the second tip is to normalize anti-racist talk. So what we know is that avoiding talking about race does not keep children from noticing race, does not keep children from developing ideas about race, does not keep children from developing bias by preschool age. And so if adults avoid discussing about race, what it teaches kids is adults don't like talking about race. So we're not achieving what we intend to do when we avoid talking about race. So we need to normalize talking about race, racism, racial inequity with kids. We want to avoid silence, but we also want to avoid colorblind language. Sometimes what adults do is when a child says something like, I'll use an example here from Dr. Beverly Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she uses an example of a white toddler in the grocery store saying, why is that man dirty, when she sees a black man? And that the mother's response is to shush the child. That would be silencing. But another thing adults often do in that situation is they use colorblind language, where they just say something like, we don't talk about other people, you might make him sad, you don't want to make him sad, do you? And so they haven't really answered the child's question, which is really about, skin tone, skin color, race, and probably I'm guessing then this child has a pretty homogenous, a white world in which she functions if this is the first time she's seen an African-American person. But the idea is that we're not only avoiding silence, we want to avoid using colorblind language when a child asks a color-conscious question. We also don't want to only wait for kids to bring it up. So it's important to find ways to, this is what I mean by normalizing, that we're not only reactive, we're proactive. So we find ways to sort of bring up talking about these issues. And we want to use the concept of fairness to help. So basically, one thing that happens is when adults talk to kids about racism, they often tend to make it an individual good, bad person thing. So if a child says, why did this bad thing happen? An adult might say like, well, that person who did it is sick. And while that's an understandable kind of answer, it doesn't help kids understand these patterns that they're seeing in the world around them, and how this is really a societal issue of group unfairness. And so we want to use the concept of fairness to help. I'll use an example from here in Milwaukee. A white mother at the time of a white 4-year-old son was telling me about a situation where she was driving basically from a predominantly white area west through a predominantly Black area to go to the suburbs, to go to a mall. And so they started their day right on Lake Michigan, as you can imagine, just like if you've been to Chicago, the fancy wealthier people live right on the shores of Lake Michigan. And there was a shiny new Whole Foods at the time. And they stopped there and got some snacks or something, some food. And as they drove west along North Avenue, which is a major thoroughfare, they're driving through an overwhelmingly Black neighborhood. And her son says, why don't brown people have grocery stores? Or why don't brown people have Whole Foods? Something like that. And so here was a way where he was noticing a racialized pattern. It wasn't about individual sick people, but it was a pattern of unfairness. And she was able to say to him, now, do you think that's fair that people with white skin would have more easy and fair access to fresh food than brown and Black people? Well, if you know kids, they have a very, very keen sense of fairness. And so you want to use this to your advantage. They know what is fair and what is not fair. And so here was an example where, no, of course, the child doesn't think it's fair. Now, it is important to get at this group, fairness and unfairness, so that they understand that this is not earned, it's not deserved, but also that it's not just about individual mean or bad people being mean or bad or immoral, but it's something that as a society, we need to work on, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. But you also want to make sure that you are not scaring the child, or burdening them with shame or fear. And so especially if the child is a child of color, you don't want to just say, hey, the world is unfair to Black people. Okay, that's it. Good luck. Now you know. Not that a parent or an adult would do that, but this just gets me to the point that we want to always, always, always tie talk of fairness with empowerment. We want to always do this. Otherwise, it would be unethical to just leave children, potentially hopeless around the unfairness of the world. And so we use their keen sense of fairness, but we tie it with empowerment. And the way we do this is to say, to show them, who's already working to change this unfairness in our community. There's people all around us who are working on this. And especially if we're talking about young kids, it's important to give them concrete examples. Older kids, 12 and older, they can be very abstract. Middle childhood kids can sort of take a concrete example and extrapolate from it. But younger kids, preschool, first grade, they need that concrete example right in front of their face. And so we want to show and involve kids. So in this particular example, the mom was able to say, there's a lot of people who've noticed the same unfairness that you just noticed, and they're working to make a change. So let's go see, Mr. Will Allen at Growing Power, who's doing, urban gardens and urban fisheries. Or let's go see Miss Venus Williams at Alice's Garden. Let's, go and see what we can do to help change, this issue of unfairness that you notice. So this is really empowers them to see like, oh, there is an unfair thing, but it's being changed. People care about this, and we can be part of this too. And so an important part here for both parents and teachers is, how are we going to be part of that work? Now, I'm using a lot of examples from younger kids here, mostly because adults tend to have a harder time thinking about how to engage younger children on this. But these are important things to do with, middle schoolers and high schoolers as well. To sort of think about this, not just abstractly, but think about it as all of our collective responsibility, and think about how, we can be engaged in this. And this is important for children's mental health around these issues. Otherwise, the issue of structural racism, as I'm sure many adults have experienced too, is emotionally overwhelming. And so this empowerment part is really, really important. I'll just say here briefly, because I mentioned that research has shown that only teaching about racism in the past, which is what our curriculum tends to do, whether it's the civil rights movement or for older children enslavement, it tends to talk about racism in the past. And for many of us in the North, it tends to focus on the South. So it's important to help kids understand that this is not just an issue of the past. This is not an issue of somewhere else. We need to really explain how racism in the past still affects us in the present. So I'll just give one little example here. If a white child says, well, I dressed up as The Incredible Hulk for Halloween, and I put green paint on my face. So I don't see what was wrong when my white friend wanted to put, brown paint on his face when he wanted to dress up as this African-American character he admired. Right? Here's an example to help the child not to make false equivalencies, to help them understand why past racism is still present in many ways and still affects us. So here, if it's a young child, you could simply say, after the end of enslavement for African Americans in the United States, there were white people who put brown makeup on their face and pretended to be Black people in order to make fun of them and to make them seem like they weren't as smart and to make them seem like they weren't really fully humans and to make it seem like they shouldn't be free. And so this is a really painful and insidious wouldn't be a word you would use with a young child, but this was something that was really done to hurt Black people and to make it seem like they were less than. And it's part of, this unfairness we've been talking about and how it got really tangled up in our history. And so that's why it's not the same when you wore your green Hulk makeup as when your friend wanted to wear brown makeup. So there are age-appropriate ways to help kids understand that racism isn't only in the past, it's around today. And it doesn't only look like, what they've learned about, fire hoses and dogs being sicked on children, in Selma, but it looks, different today, in some cases the same, but in many cases different, but also to help them understand how that past racism, it's still with us in many ways. It still affects us in many ways. Now, some people say, okay, how do you want me to teach my 4-year-old that there's institutional racism that's been built into the structures of our society? That's, with older children, you can really teach that in abstract ways. How do we do that with younger children? I came up with something I call the spider web game that you can do with younger kids, where you just give the kids, each a ball of string and have a room that's kind of empty and ask them to make a spider web. And they go over and under and around and they get all tangled up. And there they've used up their balls of string and now they have a spider web. And then you say, great, now let's untangle it. Well, usually they start to untangle it, but after a little while, they see how much harder it is to untangle than tangle. And there you can simply say, that unfairness we've been talking about? Well, it's been getting tangled up in our country forever. Before I was born, they think that's, ancient Ice Age history. But you can say before, your grandparents were born, and even before your grandparents' grandparents were born, this unfairness was tangled up. And we learned about Sojourner Truth, and she did a lot of untangling. And we learned about Frederick Douglass, and he did a lot of untangling. And we learned about Cesar Chavez, and he did a lot of untangling, and so on and so forth. And you can say, but you can see how it's really hard to untangle. And so we still have to do that untangling today. And that's why we went to meet Miss Venus Williams, and she taught us about what she's doing to untangle. So even with young kids, this can be a way to engage them in anti-racist work. The only danger there is they might say like, well, Mom, I untangled the spider web, so racism is solved. And then you'd have to just talk to them about how, the unfairness is tangled up even more than our spider web that we made here. So we have to keep untangling. I hope I'm doing okay. I'm going to give you one more here and then I'll check back in with the moderators, but please feel free to cut me off if I'm going on too long. The fifth one is model. We're always teaching our children, whether as teachers or as parents or other adults in their lives, we're teaching them about race all the time, even if we don't know it. So for parents and teachers, what choices are we making about our environments and theirs, and what messages might those be sending? How are we reacting to racialized situations when they're observing us? And we have to be very conscious of sort of doing that do as I say, not as I do message, because kids are not buying that, right? So if we say, oh, it's really important to have friends of all different races, but then we only have friends of our own race over to our house. Well, this is different in COVID times, but they observe these things. So they see, oh, it's not that important to her. She says it is, but it doesn't seem to be. So that modeling is really important. And I will say here that it's also good to model for them when you don't know answers to things. Sometimes I think adults are scared to engage in conversations with children because they're worried they won't really know what to say. And it is okay if a child brings something up for you to say, I'm really frustrated that, and I'm a little sad and angry that I don't know the answer to that, because I think it's part of the unfairness we've been talking about, that I wasn't taught this in school, or, whatever the situation is. Or it's okay to say, and then you can say, we can research it together, or I'm going to learn, or I'm glad you asked me because we can learn together. It's also okay to say that, sometimes you get sad thinking about these things, and asking them, what their emotions are around it. So we don't have to be perfect, I guess is what I'm saying. The sixth one is to help them do just that, to process their feelings. They're going to have a lot of feelings around issues of racial inequity. And so helping them think about, how they've felt, how they've reacted if they've encountered these issues in the past, and to think about, what they might do if they encounter them in the future. And I'm not trying to be specifically or purposely vague here, but what this will look like for, an Asian 14-year-old boy in Houston versus a Latino 6-year-old in New York City versus, and so on. It's going to be a different kind of a conversation. One universal tool that you can always use, however, is the question, what makes you say that? So if a child says something about race that maybe seems biased or just seems to make a particular assumption, it's always useful, instead of sort of feeling like you have to have an answer and tell them what's right and wrong, to ask them, what makes you say that? And it can be very helpful in getting at their thinking. So here I'll share a story about a young Latino boy who said he wanted to be white. And his parents were very upset because they felt that they had raised him to have, pride, and to racial and ethnic pride, and to love himself and his heritage. And so they were just devastated by this. But it turned out, when asking the question, what makes you say that? The child wanted to be a physician. And he had only ever seen white physicians. And he was young enough that he didn't have what psychologists call race constancy. This usually comes around 7. And he just thought that to be a physician, you needed to be white. So the first step was to be white. So here's a way where sort of what the parents' initial ideas about what the child meant was different than was different than his intent. Another story came from a white child who said that Black men were scary, and it turned out that he was talking about a character dressed in a Black ninja outfit. Now, kids do actually make elisions between that kind of symbolic color and race, so that one worries me a bit more, but it can help the parent understand, or the teacher understand, where the comment came from in order to help the child process. And then the very last tip is to do what I call teaching critical race literacy. And that just means to teach kids to start recognizing racialized patterns and messages, and sort of critically thinking about them on their own. This is important because you can do it with young people of any age, and it's something that sticks with them. It's a tool that they use on their own. So, sort of asking them, well, what patterns are we seeing? And, why are we seeing them? What seems off here? So like, why, when I'm watching movies, do I see white characters in all different times, eras, all different settings, doing all different kinds of things? But when I see American Indian characters, they're only in these 1 or 2 settings, and they're only in the past, and they're only engaging in, they're only doing these 1 or 2 things. So just helping kids sort of notice these patterns and getting them to think critically about them. Why is it when I see a young Black person accused of a crime, they're shown in a mugshot, but I see a young white person of the same age accused of a crime, they're shown in their graduation cap and gown? Or why is it, at your high school, the dress code seems to sort of really single out what might be called like urban, African-American fashion trends. So just sort of helping them see some patterns in the world around them and start to think critically, because unfortunately we're so bombarded with misrepresentations and narrow ranges of images that they can become acclimated into our subconscious at a very young age, to a way that we don't actually notice these things when they appear in front of us. So psychologists have shown that we have to bring these things to consciousness in order to counter implicit bias or subconscious bias. And again, this is important and doable no matter the child's age, their racial identity, or their local context. So that was my very long answer. And I hope that I gave enough of a range of examples there so that you might be able to think about how you would really apply this to the specific young people in your life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winkler. That was phenomenal and just so well done. And I think people, I know I learned a lot, and I feel like hopefully people are walking away with real tips and really understanding how they can engage with the children in their lives. And with that, people are parents and teachers frequently really want to know what to do when these teachable moments arise, and how they can not miss out on an opportunity. Is that something you could talk a little bit more about?
Sure. I mean, I think part of this is getting ahead of things. So when we put ourselves in a position where we're always having to be reactive, and we do want to be reactive, but we sort of sell ourselves short. So this takes me back to that tip number 2, normalizing a discussion about race, so that if you're a teacher in the classroom, and you're sort of bringing up these kinds of issues every day as a normal part of conversation in terms of, I don't know, even if you have texts you have to teach, you can do this, like, have you noticed that, I'm just going to use an example that came up recently locally, sort of the freshmen at the high school, in their English class, they had all different texts, and the only text that spoke about racism or anti-Black racism that they read was To Kill a Mockingbird. And there was just this discussion around why is there's, some people felt like, oh, no, you can't pick on To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a classic and it has great lessons. But still the teachers were engaging in this discussion about why is it that the only assigned text that deals with anti-Black racism not only is set in the past and in the South, which we've already talked about are sort of tropes that Northern whites tend to use to keep racism as seeming far away from them, but also that it's from the point of view of a white protagonist. So this is sort of an interesting, it's not saying the book is bad or that it's, something that shouldn't be read, but what does this mean within our curriculum, whose voices are being centered, whose perspectives are being centered? So that's just one example off the top of my head. But what I mean here is that if we're normalizing these conversations on a daily basis, then we're less likely to get sort of blindsided. Teachers or parents tend to be worried about the big blow up, the big emotional blow up. But if you're modeling for kids that this is something that you're willing to talk about, you might not have all the answers right up front, but you're willing to, you are going to validate their racialized experiences rather than shutting them down or silencing them, which is what they're more likely to be used to. That's a great thing to sort of never miss an opportunity, is to be proactive instead of just reactive. Although there's nothing wrong with also being reactive, but setting up that environment, what social psychologists call the racial cueing. So even, walking through a school building, what kind of racial cueing is going on? Whose artwork is up? Who's in positions of power? Who's, those kinds of things. There's racial cueing in the institution overall, but there's also racial cueing in your classroom or in your household or in your living room about how adults react to topics about race and racism, and how those kinds of things are handled in this particular environment. I think also relevant here is that tip number 1, being part of this learning yourself. it's difficult. We can be scared of reacting to teachable moments, or we can not even recognize teachable moments as teachable if we don't have some of this knowledge and background ourselves. And again, that can be a pretty overwhelming task, but it's important to sort of work on it the way you would any other big task, which is just small pieces, you know, day by day. I don't mean to trivialize learning about racism, but I'm just thinking that I had this invasive species removal to do in my yard this year, and it took me all the way from March until October. But I told myself, I had been avoiding it for a couple of years, and I told myself, you just do it, just focus on this square foot, you know, and that's a silly thing, but it can help us in terms of taking on overwhelming tasks. And I think we need to think of this anti-racist self-education as an overwhelming task that can be handled in small bites if we commit to the work. And then I also think that last tip on helping kids develop that critical race literacy, other scholars, and I want to make sure I cite the right person, and her name is evading my mind right now, but there's a scholar who calls this raising resistors, that parents raise resistors, you know, critical thinkers, or teachers raise resistors. It's an education scholar who coined that term. And so kids are constantly consuming, you know, curricula, textbooks, or media of some sort. Even parents who think they're protecting their kids from media, it's mighty difficult to keep kids away from all sources of media and or you know, material consumerism that derives from children's media. And so these are great opportunities to help them become critical about race. And this is something that you can do every day, all the time. Did that answer your question?
Thank you so much. Yes, Lynn is going to hop on. I think we're going to move into the breakout group. So I'm just going to step back and let you guys talk about that and set up the rooms.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Winkler. This has been amazing. And we'd love to have a chance for all of our participants to break out into a group to work with some of these questions that you've posed. I know you might have a document to share maybe with the questions. We'll pop them into the chat. We're going to have 10 minutes in the group, and they're going to be groups of 3. So we'll just go over the questions.
I made a few questions, but let me say that, you know, if it feels too regimented and the conversation is going organically, then don't worry about, you know, having to stick to these questions. But one thing I think is often I find that adults can find the tips make sense to them overall, but then when it comes to actually applying it to scenarios in their classrooms or in their homes or in their everyday lives, it can be difficult to translate. And so I want to see if you might be able to take a minute to think about your own, you know, racial identity, or the racial identity of the children in your, you know, classroom or your home, age, developmental stage, what is the racialized context of the environment, and sort of think about, you know, how might these ideas, these broad ideas, really play out in my specific context. And then some other possible questions are, what was something from the discussion that really resonated with you and why? And this could be either something that really hit you in a positive way that was useful to you, that was an aha moment, but it could also be something that really caused a point of resistance for you, where you were like, oh no, I don't agree with that at all. And it maybe, you know, caused you to shut down in some way. Both of those can be really useful, you know, sources of exploration and insight in terms of, you know, this kind of work. So that's another idea. And then the third thing is, I'm hoping that at the end, everyone can think sort of specifically about a commitment you can do, no matter how big or how small, but a commitment you can make for this kind of work, for this kind of anti-racist engagement with children.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's see, Kirsten, are the breakout
Yep.
rooms ready?
We are ready. I'm going to send everybody in. We're giving people, I think, 20 minutes. And then we're going to bring everybody back, and we'll have a chance to sort of decompress and talk about, debrief how things went in the breakouts. So
Right.
you
We'll
can
have
just
a little
follow
bit of
the
Q&A
instructions.
section too.
I'm going to send everyone to a room. Thank you.
Good.
looking at Erin's work and some of the things that were posted, your article that was posted. So enjoyed that. This is really good. I live in rural Vermont and I'm retired but active with the library system, and originally helped co-author classes for young adults and children. So this is really good information. My question is one that's been in the library for a while, is it's really hard to find, I think, well-balanced, decent books about BIPOCs in nature, not making exceptional or anything like that. And the one that I read to first and second graders was from Alan Page in Minnesota. It was about making maple sugar. And he took his grandchild out. And Alan Page is a Supreme Court judge in Minnesota, and he's a former NFL player, very, very well known. And so since there wasn't many books out there, one of the things they did was they published this book as part of their foundation. And I had to buy it for the libraries because it's not available otherwise.
Yeah, so this is something that we talk about in terms of range of images. So not so much that, so the range, I think what I hear you're saying is like, when we have images of BIPOC people, they tend to be in urban settings. Or when we have images of BIPOC people who are in nature, it's romanticized and othered, especially around American Indians. Probably.
Yeah, right. And again, this is Abenaki land up here, and is it's rare for diversity. And what I found is that stories of kids in the city don't resonate. But if I could find nature books that are just regular kids, and their family, and they love the book about making maple sugar with grandfather, and it's stuff that they do. And they're farms owned by, there's a very famous organic farm up here. So people do have some contact in the farming community with within diversity, but the books are not there for kids that really help them achieve empathy and similarity.
Well, I'm going to share some resources. I hope it'll be okay for me to share.
Of course.
If not in the Q&A, I could send like a list.
That would be awesome.
If you give me a list, when I can email it to everybody.
So one thing, I don't know if you know this, it's in Wisconsin, but I'm not just being biased. Like it's a good national resource out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's called the Cooperative Children's Book Center. And one thing that they have, in addition, they have book lists and recommended books, in addition to actually like research on representation in children's books. So they keep I'm trying to see where it would be here, but they have sort of diversity statistics. They have statistics on exactly what you're noticing. So like how are people represented? They have these statistics that they keep. Like they can tell you that during the last 10 years, only 1.5% of board books for infants showed brown characters or things like that. So that can be very useful. But then they also have book lists. And then I usually like to share also, when I send out resources, I usually just send out resources of award-winning books, but there's like the Americas Award, which is about representations of, or kids' books with representations from Latin America and the Caribbean, or there's an American Indian Award or Africana Book Award, or different things, so that not necessarily a specific title, but good lists of like award-winning books that might be helpful for you to use as a.
All right, I've written down the site now. I will go out and do some research for there. I had been managing a site about Coretta Scott King Awards, but it's still, again, even though there's fantastic books in there, it still doesn't speak very well to people in the rural setting here.
And so the only other thing I would say is then depending on the age of the children, even with young children, you can do this, but talk to them about the gaps you're noticing, right? That's the critical
Right.
literacy, where you say, why do we see this pattern? It might make you think that, you know, Black and brown people don't live in rural areas, but that's not true, you know. So
It's right, it's not true.
so it's useful to talk to them about, like, you don't think it's fair and you think it has to do with, you know, people's ideas about what groups of people are like and who gets opportunities to write books, and just getting them to think about those kinds of fairness issues is
Yeah.
important in sparking, you know, their thinking about this.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, and what
I'd like
age?
to share with you two books though that are in my collection and our home library.
Sure.
Are really wonderful for this type of thing, like you're talking about Black in nature.
Yeah.
One is this, The Secret Garden of George Washington Carver. This is
Okay.
an amazing book because he, you know, is an amazing scientist, botanist, and he loves nature. This is a really great book. You should definitely check it out if you haven't read it already. And this one I just got recently. It's called The Camping Trip.
Okay.
You can add those to your list.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And are you
That's
mostly talking about young children? Are you talking about picture books mostly?
Yeah, I think that because I'm trying to make sure that not only the library, but also the elementary schools have the books that are just when kids, it's a rare class that has diversity in where we live, though there are some classes, but really kids are growing up deprived. You know, they are being handicapped by not getting comfortable and seeing all the diversity and creating an internal interest in it, you know, how wonderful it is. And so I have been mostly focusing on young books. I did a series for older children, but at that point we're backpedaling, I feel.
Yeah. I was just asking because I think about this book, which I think of as for middle readers more. I mean, the character is a 7th grader, but I think even like a 5th grader could probably, in my experience, generally when we're talking about diversity in books, and especially when we're talking about racism in books, it's easier to find diversity than dealing with helping kids understand racism and racial inequity. Still, even so, picture books and young adult novels do better than these middle. I just can't find as many for, you know, the really, you know, the 4th, 5th, 6th grader. It's a little bit harder. So this is one I do like, and it's about, the subtitle is A Border Kid's Poems.
Okay.
And so he's a Latino boy, although his nickname is a nickname given to light-skinned people. So he does sort of deal with the, like, people thinking he's white, and it's actually written in poems, which I don't even, this is going to make me sound uncultured, but I don't think of myself as someone who generally reads poetry. But I found this, it's really great. It reads like a novel, you know, but it's good for readers who want to read 1 or 2 pages at a time because they're poems and they're diverse. And he's also doing the regular kid stuff of like having a crush on a girl and this, but it's also talking about like how he's treated differently, and, you know, but also just like cooking with his family. And so it's not exactly, you know, it's not northern Vermont rural, but it's, or rural Vermont rural, but it's a different kind of,
Sure. And down in the DC area, Shout Mouse Press has done a number of good books. They started out of a writing project in high schools to encourage people to write. And so we've used those for reading experiments and listening experiments. And it covers both Black and Latino children. And the book you showed me, they call me Guerrero, would be something my grandsons would like, since they are border children.
Good, wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, Lynn and Kirsten, I hope I didn't go too far over, and I hope it was what you wanted. I wasn't totally on top of the time, but I hope it was what you wanted.
Yeah, it was perfect. No, it was, and there were a lot of chats. Oh my gosh, did you see Someone said, Dr. Winkler's tips are great. This talk is so important. Thank you. As you spoke, Mr. Rogers came to mind. You are the female version in the way you speak and teach. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's like the highest
Yeah.
compliment ever. I might have to document.
Yeah.
I have to say that, you know, every time recently I just came across Daniel Tiger on yes, and I just felt like, wow, that show does a really good job with, I mean, not necessarily issues of race, but just like, wow, Mr. Rogers' legacy around helping kids really understand. I'm thinking like there's a lot of adults that need to watch the show and learn about processing emotions and engaging with people and stuff. Well, that's so wonderful.
Yeah, no, I found it really, really helpful. And yeah, it was everything we wanted and more. So,
Oh, good, good, good.
yeah, I think that people will find it very helpful. And we are definitely going to link to it in our challenge and our family challenge that we create. Because I think that, you know, parents are struggling with this. And I think it's sort of like they need to hear this, just the hard facts and the science behind it, because we all have these misperceptions about children.
Yeah.
You know, and I think once you understand that and you see you're actually doing harm, I mean, you're not, you know,
Right.
they're absorbing all of this. And if you don't say anything, you're just showing them. And I think for sure, people don't pay attention to the fact that their body language, their tone, you know, that it's the same way, like even if you look at a family, you know, how each member of the family as a child sort of, you know, knows their place or knows their value, all of those things, it's just the same thing applies with the greater world, the outside, you know, the outside world. And they see who's valued, who's not, who you act like you're scared of, who you don't want to be around, who, you know, they pick up on all that nonverbal. And meanwhile, you're saying, oh, everybody's the same, but apparently, you know, you act like it's not. Oh my gosh, I'm sure you've read Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt. She has a line in there about her son. I think he was like, I forget what age, but he was pretty young, like maybe 6. And they were in the grocery store and he noticed that there was a Black man in the grocery store and how people were acting. You know, he was noticing that people seemed to want to not go near him and that his grocery line was much shorter. And, you know, she was doing all the things you said, which is like, you know, just asking, you know, what makes you say that? Or what do you think? And he finally said he thought that it was fear, that he thought people were afraid of him. Anyway, it was just really, it was really sad. I mean, it was really sad, but it was also very illustrative of how much children pick up, even though you don't realize all the things they're taking in. I see we have a guest.
Yes.
We have an extra guest.
I'm glad this happened not during the presentation part. I find if I lock him out, then he just cries outside the door and distracts me.
And then that's a problem.
Yes, sorry.
These animals are funny.
My dogs are both in the basement right now because they would be literally like chewing their bones underneath the table, like jumping in my lap.
Oh, I have to show you a picture of Lynn's dog last night. Can you see? He's in front of the
enjoying
fire.
the fire.
Yes, but then
He loves to sit by the fire.
yes, he's just sitting there.
He's so disciplined though. He knows not to go too close.
Yeah, he doesn't go in, but he loves to be by it. Yeah, it's so interesting how they're just so connected with fire, for elements. Yeah. But I think also, you know, Dr. Winkler, the issue what we've found looking in a lot of these children's books is there, like you said, there are so many books on diversity, but when you look at them, there's so many that still perpetuate anti-Blackness.
Yes.
A lot.
Yeah, we read a book that was about the other, like sort of being left out and excluded. But the girl that was being left out and excluded was Black, but she was the one that was also doing all these really mean things. And they never tied it in to say like maybe there was some reason why, but it was sort of, you know, anyway, it just didn't help.
Like
that's the problem, I think. I think the problem is
mean Black girl. identity.
I think the problem is when colorblind language is used, and I have trouble finding children's books that help kids understand racism explicitly and are in the current moment. Right? There's a lot more that are about figures in the past than there are about contemporary. And then when it's contemporary, it's more likely to be diversity, like representation of different groups, rather than why are these people being treated unfairly and why is that wrong? There's fewer of those, or it'll be where someone's being excluded, but the kid is just supposed to notice that the person is brown, but there's no explanation of why, they're more likely to see that. Why are they seeing this kind of exclusion? And, so, yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have a lot more Black authors writing books, because it seems like, right now is the time that people are actually interested in publishing Black authors.
Right, that's the thing. The Black authors are writing the books.
Right.
Who the publishers are. Who the publishers are using to publish and promote.
Yeah. But it seems like there's a change in that, at least temporarily. It might be, the in thing to do right now to have a couple of new Black, like the token Black authors, but hopefully it'll be long-term.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I think we sent them in at like 4:59.
Yeah, they maybe have like one or
It
two.
wasn't quite 5. Okay.
No, it was about 6.
Oh, let me just send them a message saying they have 7 minutes left.
No, don't give them 7 minutes if you want to have. Do you want to have time for Q&A?
You can only get like 2 more minutes.
Yeah, do 2.
Oh, 2 more minutes. Okay.
Yeah, because we're already at 12 after.
Okay.
Yeah. And they went in at, I think it was like 4:56.
Oh, okay.
They're pretty much at 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Had some nice, robust conversation.
We'll just see, because sometimes what happens in groups is that questions come up that they want to pose. They want to pose to the full group.
Yeah.
And I can be a little wordy in my answers. I'll try not to be.
Oh, it's great. It's great. I think it's good. It's a good practice, because I think we've gotten into a place where we don't speak that much, and like we're not thinking so much, and so we don't have a lot to share. But the more you hear other people really critically thinking and talking, it gets your muscle, practicing and going, so that you can start kind of thinking that in that way as well. So I love that you were verbose in your answers.
Okay, thank you.
I wouldn't even say verbose. I just think it was thorough. It was, you covered a lot. It was like nuggets, real important nuggets of information.
Good. Okay.
So
it was done in a way that people feel like they could engage in it. That
great,
it's something
wonderful. I worry about seeming like you're sitting in class. That's what I don't want to
do. No, not at all. Because Anna was so interesting. I felt like everything was really interesting. So I'm going to close the rooms now, because it takes a minute.
The article of yours, children are not colorblind. Now that is a heavy one to get through, with all of those, resources and, but
I have to tell you that I wrote an article for.
I love that article. It's one of my go-tos, but
I wrote one for BuzzFeed. That's a lot easier to get through. I'd rather have that one.
Oh, I think, yes, we did want to get that link. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I think you sent this. I remember we talked about that.
All right, I think everyone's back. Welcome back. Oh, some people are back. Yeah.
I don't think everyone's back.
I think a few are coming.
Yeah, there's still, I'm looking at, we still have a few people in the rooms.
Welcome back, everyone. Here they come. Let's see.
Yes, we have about 4 more people, 5 more people who are still in their group.
Right. It's hard to come back when your conversation is going so well.
I think everybody's back.
All right, wonderful. Great. So we hope everyone had a great breakout session, and we'd love to just kind of popcorn around, since it's a very intimate group. If you want to share some insights, some reflections that came out of your group, and also if there's any questions afterwards, we would love to have some time, 5 minutes or so, to talk with Dr. Winkler. We can ask questions at that point, or you can just pop your questions into the chat now, and we can make sure that we have them. So if we don't get to all of the questions answered, we can talk to Dr. Winkler and send that to you as a follow-up at the end of this video. So feel free to jump in.
I'll also say that I have spoken with Kirsten and Lynn about possibly sending just a resource sheet. So if you're interested in some further reading and also like places to find books for kids and maybe places to read more about implicit bias in adults or history of racism or any of these things, that I can just sort of send a resource list. I will say, while I have you here as a captive audience, I just want to show you a couple of my favorite websites. So the one I really, really want to recommend first is called Embrace Race. And the reason I love this website, there's many, many reasons I love this website and this group. But one reason is I think a lot of the resources that are out there for adults talking to children about race sort of presume that it's white people who need help with this and that people of color have it all figured out. And of course, people of color have to deal with racism because of their daily lives and circumstances. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily easy for, you know, a parent of a Black 4-year-old to explain to him, you know, anti-Blackness or police violence or things like that. So I think this website and this group does a fantastic job of really addressing needs of all different kids. They do a great job of centering the voices of experts of color. So I think that you'll just really have a great time exploring this website. Also, if you particularly want to talk about, there's more resources for diverse books or talking about diversity than there are for really help kids understand racism and racialized violence and things that they're likely to be coming into their consciousness in the contemporary moment. And so the Center for Racial Justice in Education has a good site that's resources for talking really specifically about these tougher topics with kids. And again, diversity, cultural heritage, history, pride, all those things are important. It's just easier to find resources. And so that's why I'm not focusing on that here. It's a little bit harder to talk about this unfairness, racialized violence, racism. Raising race-conscious children is another good resource. And then finally, I just want to say that a lot of communities have local organizations. This is one where I live called Rid Racism Milwaukee that talks about like specifically things for how families and kids can get involved. So you want to look for that in your own area. And then I was just talking here in our small group about the Cooperative Children's Book Center that has lists of books for kids, but I'll also send you some more lists. Oh, my cat is going to come up on the camera. I'm sorry, you all. I'm going to move him out of the way. Sorry.
Wonderful, thank you. So yes, if people want to share anything, I've been monitoring the chat. We did have one comment about wanting to hear more about the web example you gave. I think you talked about the spider web game and the kids trying to untangle and how that, using that to explain unfairness in America.
Okay, so instead of talking about it here in case other people have questions, what I'm going to do is tell you that I wrote about it for that bastion of academic writing, BuzzFeed. So I wrote a piece for this on BuzzFeed, and so I will send you a link to that. And in that, I talk about a little bit more about that that spiderweb activity as a way to help kids understand, or young children understand, systemic racism. Here's the article. So anyway, I'll send you a link to that. But in there it talks a little bit more about the spider activity. I'm not sure it says too much more, but I think it might help you think a little bit more about that. And it's also an easy read. I mean, just because, you know, who wants to read a bunch of academic articles? I know that's not everyone's speed. So that one won't take you all day to read.
Wonderful. Anybody else? And you don't have to type in your question. You could just unmute yourself and we're happy to hear your question.
Don't be shy. We're practicing talking about race.
Yeah, tell us what came up. Did you guys have trouble? Was it just you guys sitting there looking at each other, or did you finally get it going? Have any stumbling blocks? We have the expert here in the house right now. Now's the time to ask her.
Well, Wendy, Jade, and I, we really talked about how to try and go against biases, not necessarily how to be anti-racist, but ours, Jade brought up how young children say, how boys can't have long hair and how boys can't wear dresses and stuff like that. And I'm part Native, and our hair is really, really special for us. It holds a lot of spirituality. It holds a lot of honor and respect for our ancestors, for our families. And I always laugh when I get asked, when am I going to cut my hair? And my answer is I normally don't. Really, we only cut it during signs of mourning. And the last time I cut it was October 3rd, 2017. So it's hair for Native Americans especially is a way for us to help feel connected within our communities, within our families.
So I think this is a great example of the what makes you say that sort of line of thinking, because I didn't follow that further, but often with kids or with adults, to be honest with you, you can use the what makes you say that when they say something biased, like boys aren't supposed to have long hair. And so you're going to say, what makes you say that? And then, the sort of next step in that is to start poking holes in their thinking, not in a one-upsmanship kind of way, but with little kids, if they're saying boys aren't supposed to have, what makes you say that? Well, they're going to say about patterns they see. Then you can say, well, you might be making that assumption because there's been some unfairness in the United States to Native people. And so Native people's perspectives and histories, don't get shared in your classroom or in whatever in the way it should be. I'm sort of riffing on, you'd want to work on this a little bit, but and talk about, so that tells me that we need to talk more about Native culture and the importance of hair, for men and women and this kind of thing. So it's you can always start with the what makes you say that, but then you can sort of start, I don't want to say you can poke holes in their argument, but essentially by just introducing new information. And then for kids, tying that to this history of unfairness. This is why you don't know these things. This is why these experiences, practices, and histories are subordinated. You wouldn't say subordinated to, depending on the age of the kid, but left out of what you're being taught. And do you think that's fair? And of course, they don't think that's fair. So who are people we can find in our community, or who are authors of books we can read, who are working against this unfairness of silencing the experiences of Native peoples?
Thank you so much for sharing that, AJ. Yeah, anybody else? I can say that I have a senior in high school, but I remember when he was little, and I don't know if it was kindergarten or first grade, but we were at school one day and he was like, "Mom, there's a boy just like me." And he was seeing a boy who was Black, who actually, ironically enough, they did resemble each other. Like, they were the same coloring. They both had their hair the same way. They both wore glasses. And so I think it's interesting for people to understand that why is that? We want to see ourselves in how do you feel when you see someone who looks like you, particularly if you're in a non-diverse setting. So maybe, I don't know, Erin, Dr. Winkler, if there's something you want to add.
Well, so there's something called the documentary effect. And basically the short version of this is the less real world contact children have with people of a certain group, the more likely they are to think that what they see in media is true. So this is why we call it a documentary effect, an inverse relationship between real world experience and reliance on media representations. And I raise this to say that if the child is living in a relatively racially segregated environment, even if, for example, their own family environment is diverse kind of thing, that media representations, including children's literature, social media, depending on their age, all these kinds of things, and textbooks and curriculum become even more important because they tend to think like, oh, this is where I get information about that group, or this is what that group is like. And so even if, like with the case of your son, if he knows it's not true from his own experiences and his own family, if the images are so dominant and overwhelming in the media, the child can start to think, well, maybe I'm an exception. Maybe Black people really are like that, for example. Or especially we have this documented with white children who are living in very segregated environments, who just end up thinking like, oh, this is what Latinx people are like, or this is what Asian people are like, and so on. And so it's important to really get into those critical race literacy discussions. So in this case, like, why is it that white people are overrepresented in US media? So, why is it if we're watching a particular show, you're like, well, I've been to New York City. And when I'm in New York City, I notice that it's actually, mostly not white people. So New York City is something like 40% white or something like that. So it's very interesting to me that in this TV show about New York City, I'm only seeing white people, or something like that. So you just help disrupt for kids the idea that, what they're seeing or what they're experiencing can seem to them like it's the rule or it's the norm. And so to help them sort of disrupt those ideas about, so that even if they're not, I guess what I'm saying is you're talking about the importance of representation, which is true, but given that we currently have a not very representative, range of images of representation of people of color in media, and we can widen that to curriculum and textbooks, that it's important to help kids understand, to help them understand that this is not documentary, this is not truth. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, and
Wonderful, thank you.
We have one more question. This comes from Bertha. She would like to hear a little bit more about how to discuss violence against non-white people. Situations like George Floyd's murder and other situations that are very violent and hard to discuss. What's really appropriate to share and talk with young children to explain this to them at that
Right. Okay. So this is something where, of course, we need to be very careful. And so it depends on the child's context. We want them to feel safe still, but we want them to know about the, the unfairness, that this wasn't anything that was deserved. So partially this will depend on how much they know and how much the parent is comfortable sharing. I don't mean to defer here, but there's been some really, really good stuff written about this. So I want to go back to Embrace Race, and I wish I could find it. There's a webinar exactly on this with some experts who I think will really be helpful to you. And I would love to be able to link you right to that. So I want to be able to find that for you. So I'd like to be able to send that, but there's a webinar that's exactly on this topic. How do we talk to Black children about violence against Black people, and specifically about, police violence and police murder of Black men, women, and children, because, many of these, children are 7 and 12, and it's not only something that faces adults, so it's important to talk to kids about it. I also will just say again, I know I already said this, but there's one article here there's a psychologist named Howard Stevenson. I'm trying to remember if I think he's at Penn State, but he might be at Penn.
He's also Lion's Story. If you look up Lion's Story, he's one of the co-founders or directors of that.
Okay, and so he has a great, just short piece interview. I think it was linked on this page. If not, I'll find it for you. for, let me write myself a note so I don't forget, on exactly this topic too, that also came out just this year. So I don't mean to be shirking responsibility for answering the question, but I think that there are some African-American experts who speak really, really well to this, and I probably won't even do justice. So I'm gonna
like the white perspective. It says here, she's interested in the white perspective and also to talk to white children about it.
Oh, okay,
Not
okay,
just
okay.
to Black people.
Okay. So I do think those resources will be helpful too. I don't know, there's a book I'm going to show you, but it's a little controversial. People feel different ways about it. So I'm going to let you read it and decide for yourself. But there's a picture book called Something Happened in Our Town. That's about police violence, anti-Black police violence. And it goes through sort of a young elementary school white girl going home and asking her parents about this, and then an elementary school Black boy going home and talking to his parents about it. And then they sort of discuss it a bit in the schoolyard. So that's a book that you might be interested in sharing. But I think what you have to do is, again, put it in this context of this tangled up history of unfairness, specifically anti-Blackness. And so not making it sound like it was just one sick officer, but that it was part of a system that devalues people. And so when people are saying, when you see people saying Black Lives Matter, they're not saying Black Lives Matter more than other people's lives. The reason they're saying Black Lives Matter is tangled up in our country before mom was born, before, your grandparents were born. You got to give them, little kids are not going to know what 1856 means or whatever, right? So we have to, or 1619 means. So we're going to have to sort of tell them way a long time before your grandparents were born, that this unfairness, this making it seem like Black people's lives didn't matter as much and treating Black people like their lives didn't matter as much has been tangled into the way our country was run. And even though, you can talk about all these people who have done this work around untangling, some of that unfairness is still around. And so when we see, in the cartoons that Native people are portrayed, in this way, or that, white people are always the heroes or whatever, these patterns that you're helping them understand, this is part of this. This is part of this sort of making it seem like some people are more important than others. Some people are more advanced than others. Some people are more moral than others. And that this is an unfairness that existed to try to explain away or justify treating people differently based on skin color. I'm sort of doing this in sort of low elementary age language. You could adjust it based on, I'm doing this sort of in 6-year-old language, but you could adjust it. But that it's really important because we tend to, when there's like the Charleston shooting or police violence, there tends to be a discussion about it as extreme. And, it is extreme in a way, but another way it's very actually normative in the US history of anti-Black racism and violence. And so what we want to do is say, like, this is actually part of our society that's a problem, and that, but don't lose hope because people are working to change it. And this is where you get to that empowerment part about all the progress that has been made and all the work that's yet to be done. And what is our role? What is our family's role? Who are some people we can meet who are working on this, and how can we be involved? So I think for the fairness part, you want to get on that. But I think for the empowerment, often for white kids, the issue is that it not turn into shame. And often for kids of color, it's that it not turn into just total soul crushing fear or, victim feeling, scared. So it's very important to have that empowerment part and to think about your own child and their age and their development and how to, I do want to say with Black children, if I know I mentioned the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Tatum. She's got a chapter in there on younger children called The Early Years, something like, am I brown because I eat chocolate milk? And she talks in there about ways to talk with young children. Here she's talking about slavery, but how she could talk to it with her 5-year-old without him thinking it was going to happen to him tomorrow, that he was going to be kidnapped out of his home kind of thing. And I think that same advice can be used in talking to children about police violence so that you can help them understand this as a phenomenon, but also discuss it in ways so that they do not have a great amount of fear.
Wonderful, thank you. I feel like we could keep talking, for hours with our tea mugs by the fire with you, Dr. Winkler. Thank you so much. We've really enjoyed this time with you and hope you can come back again. We're going to be closing now, and we would like to just say thanks and then also let you know that there's some upcoming events happening very soon. Kirsten, do you want to share a little bit about?
Sure, we've got Joe Feldman, who's going to be talking about grading, equity in grading. And then in January, we have several events where we haven't quite posted about them yet, but we've got Julie Lithcott-Hames. We have someone from Lion Story, which is where Howard Stevenson, they're brothers, are. And then speaking of Equal Justice Initiative, that's Brian Stevenson's organization. We're going to have a staff member joining us. And then we have Jenna Arnold, who is going to talk about her book and experience with white women stepping into these hard conversations. And we've got Professor Liliana Mason from University of Maryland, who wrote the book Uncivil Agreement. It's going to be talking about politics and this sort of tribal politics that we're living in, and how all of that relates to race and what we can do to try to make that better. So with that.
Oh, and we'd also like to just encourage everyone, if you have not already joined our challenge, just as Dr. Winkler says, and we also agree, we have to start with ourselves and do this inner work first. We have a free 30-day challenge, then we'd love for you to join and start doing that work.
Yep, you can find us on.
Yeah, you can follow us on our website, on Instagram, on Twitter, and on Facebook. Thank you so much for being with us today, everyone. Enjoy the week.
We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Bye.